talked about. Let's start with what happened today. And today was a practice day where the media got to go and watch about 30 minutes of it, as we saw with the video of you and Drake Keeler there talking about practice. The offense and the defense, they were trading punches. And it was the 12th of 15 practices so far in fall camp. I guess, Erin, just in general, what did you see out there today? And also, what did you kind of hear with the press conferences afterwards?
You know, it's funny how we heard from Whipple and, Casey Thompson after, and Whipple had talked about how, like, the offense just didn't bring the juice today. It was really bizarre because, like, the vibes, at least in, like, the time that we were out there, you couldn't get that sense. But at the same time, we are there in a very limited amount of time. So we're not there through, probably some of the harder portions of practice, I would say. So you kind of miss some of how they're feeling in those moments. So, like, I have no doubt that, like, if they're saying, yeah, we weren't, it wasn't our best day, I believe it. There's no reason for me not to believe it. But I would say, like, the offensive coaches are really fiery. Donovan Raiola, like, he curses a lot. And we were like, there's a lot that we can't use in videos. Now, I'm not saying because, like, we are like, look, I don't care if, like, people are offended by curse words or not. That's not my point. It's just, like, YouTube flags certain words, and, like, that video would have been flagged to the high heavens if we would have, like, put a lot of what Donovan was what he was yelling at his players. But, like, Applewhite is super fired up. Mickey Joseph is obviously very fired up. It was really interesting just kind of watching them work. I didn't get to see the first open practice because I was in Chicago for Big Ten volleyball media days. So for me, this is the first time I'm getting to see them in action on the field in that moment. And they definitely lived up to the hype of, like, what we've heard about them so far from the perspective of just their fiery personalities and the way that they coach. And then, Scott Frost, he spent a little time kind of watching the quarterbacks when we were there, but he spent a lot of time watching special teams, which we know that's kind of been his, like, thing through fall camp right now, is really observing special teams. So, yeah, there's a lot to dive into, but obviously I already hear the people who are like, it doesn't matter. None of it matters until a game. And it's like, of course not. Of course, that's what matters. But, it's at least something to hopefully give us some insight into what this team can be. And it'll be interesting, I guess, to see, like I said, those coaches being so fiery, to see that, like, translate into a game scenario.
I tweeted out a Twitter poll about an hour ago, and it was which position group has you most excited? And of course, at least we got one response that was like, none of them have me excited. I'm terrified of this. And I go, okay, well, let's rephrase it. Which one makes you want to dry heave the least with 2 weeks left until, the first game? And then they responded. But yeah, I mean, some people right now, they're in prove it mode. That I get it. I thought you had a couple good tweets here today, and one of them was the scoreboard of they always do testing.
I got mansplained on that, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a person was like, a 1 point in safety, but you can only have that if it's on an extra, on an extra point, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I know, like, I'm not tweeting this because it's, like, real. Like, they're obviously testing the scoreboard. Come on here.
God almighty.
At first I thought, I was like, wow, they started a baseball season already? Like,
well, this is like the second time they've done. So the last one I shared, and I was sitting in the press box, because what they're doing, for anyone who's like, what the heck is going on, is they're just running the scoreboards through a bunch of scenarios with the game coming up. And so I had seen somebody who was like, are they going to do this for Northwestern? It's like, no, because they're running through the very first home game. And I'd have to see, what was it? They had something where it was like just an insane amount of yardage for Nebraska, but Nebraska only had a touchdown. And people were just like, oh my God. It's like, look, it's going to be fine. Maybe, I don't know. It should be fine.
Well, they were testing out the scoreboard when we were there for the spring game. I mean, they test out the scoreboard almost daily for just about anything, it seems like.
Nebraska was leading North Dakota 7-3 with 12:14 to go in the first quarter. And let's see, Nebraska had 375 rushing yards and only one touchdown, according to the scoreboard. So people were like, what is happening on, and I'm like, they're just running through everything. It's just
it's electronics, people. We do testing of StreamYard for a podcast. Of course, they're probably going to do Husker Vision too, right?
Yeah, they should, and they can have fun with it.
Oh yeah. Well, we're going to get to position groups when we talk about the offense in a little bit, but just in general, kind of staying on the practice side of things. You talked about the coaches, and there's changes really across this offensive side with the coaching staff. And you mentioned some of the personalities there, Raiola and Applewhite and everything. Do you have any comparisons how you would compare Raiola in terms of how he interacts with his linemen versus, say, Austin a year ago, or, Applewhite versus Held? Anything stand out where this guy is a polar opposite from his predecessor, anything like that?
So I would say we'll start here. Like Brian Applewhite, again, and I'm not comparing the individual people, because I always say people are, again, they're human, like we were talking before we started this podcast. And so I don't want to take away from the fact that these are very real people. But just personality wise, I would say Brian Applewhite is much more fiery than Ryan Held, and take that for what it is or what it's not. You might like that or you might not. So that's why I'm saying I'd want to be careful in how I but I would just say he's very I shared a video on my TikTok of today's office, and the video of me when I turned the camera around from myself to what I was looking at cracks me up, because Brian Applewhite is storming through, yelling at Emmett Johnson. He's just yelling at him. He's like, get lower. And you can tell he's so frustrated because Emmett is staying too high. And he's like, you have to. And so you just see him kind of storm by, and then you see somebody kind of not waddle, but kind of waddle back behind him. And then there's another person waiting for the drill to start, and just kind of listening to him. You can just tell he's a very, very fiery individual. And that's not to say that Ryan Held wasn't fired up. It's just a different, the way that he kind of operates in that moment is just a little different. As far as just, he's very loud and very like I said, he's just not afraid to say what is on his mind in that moment. And kind of to go back to what Whipple said, where he was they were tired of getting yelled at. Well, that's a good example of that. He was in that moment, Applewhite was having no issue yelling at the players about what they need to be doing differently. And Mickey Joseph is not that type of fiery. He is very motivational is probably how I would say that. He is just I don't know. He's just got a very motivational presence about him, if you will. And he, that was definitely the group as I was watching them that was doing more, I would say, celebrating in moments when things happened that went well. That was sort of his group. And then I would say with the offensive line, oh my gosh, I'm going to make some people really nervous by saying this. I actually think Raiola and Greg Austin are very similar in how they approach their practice styles. Just in the way that they're Greg Austin was very, very fiery as well. He also was the kind of cursing, go at them. I would remember Greg Austin walking down the hallway between the Hawks Championship Center and Memorial Stadium, and there's these big metal beams, and he would slam his hands on them. And I'm like, how is he not breaking his hand? He's just slamming his hand as he's walking by. But that's just what his personality is just a really big, bold personality. And I think Raiola is like that as well. I haven't seen him smack his hand onto a metal beam yet, but if he did, I guess I wouldn't be overly surprised. So from an offensive line standpoint, I kind of think that room is, it's the same kind of fiery personality maybe there. But again, it's what you're hoping for is that the coaching style and what they're teaching ultimately has different results, despite how maybe their personalities are. But yeah, I just can feel some offensive, the people who are scared of the offensive line, groaning and being oh my gosh, what, why? But I do think Raiola was the one that did come in with a lot of question marks for people. So for what it's worth, that, I think the question marks continue, and that is a fair position group to say it's all talk until you see it.
Well, and Thompson today kind of called out some of the guys on the offense, saying we need more vocal guys, we need more leaders like that. And that's an area on the offensive line. We need some guys that are going to get on each other's asses for things if you're making mistakes. And we made plenty of them last year on the O-line. And so, I partially asked the question because I'd been to coaches clinics from Solich all the way up to the Frost years during the springtime. And so I would always, when we would make coaching changes, you could kind of see how does how did the Solich staff work with the players versus how did the Callahan one, how did the Pelini one, and throughout. And there's little changes in some cases. There's big changes in other cases too. It's kind of interesting to hear how this coaching staff, especially on the offensive side, which is what we're focusing tonight on, how that is going.
Yeah, it's like, I actually kind of thought about it after we left. Like, I don't think I honestly noticed Sean Beckton today. And I don't say that as like a negative toward him. I think he's very set and solid in who he is as a coach. And obviously Scott, in the changes, respected him and wanted him to stay, recognize what he has done with that group. I watched the tight ends. It's just, Sean Beckton's not he is not a fiery guy. He is not the one who's out there yelling obscenities and screaming and all that stuff. That's just not how he works. But I realized, like, after we left practice, I was like, I really didn't even have a visual on Sean Beckton. Knew he was there, just never really noticed him. Whereas if you were watching other position groups, I said, offensive line, running back, especially wide receiver, you were aware of where their position coaches were in those moments. It was like, oh, there's Raiola. Oh, there's Brian Applewhite. It's very different. And so needless to say, Sean Beckton's style of coaching is very different than I would say the rest of his offensive counterparts. But you are right, by the way. I think the offensive line and what Casey Thompson was really kind of getting at is when they talk about that defensive leadership versus that offensive leadership, I think they're looking at guys like Garrett Nelson and O'Shawn Mathis, and they're looking at them and kind of going the defense has so many leaders on it, and that's not surprising. It's not surprising to me that the defense is so leader focused and has so many of those players. But if you are Casey Thompson and you're on the other side and you're kind of watching that and you're like, we need that, you really want one of those leaders to be on the offensive line of all places. That is the place that you want them. And I will be very interested to see who steps up or maybe doesn't step up on that offensive line as far as because I think of a guy like Turner Corcoran. Now, he was out, he was not practicing today, and we don't know specifics on that. But if all is well and he is able to play, I imagine him to be somebody who could get himself pretty fiery. But you need that, I don't know, it's just we haven't seen that fiery kind of it's not that Teddy Prohaska is not a leader. It's not saying that he's not. It's just I think what they're asking for is kind of that Garrett Nelson approach, and you can't force that on someone, but it's definitely something that I think is missing on the offensive side of the ball, at least more widespread. And I that was my interpretation of what Casey was saying is we need more. We need to be able to compete with the other side of the ball. We need more of that.
Yeah, and Juergens kind of was that on the O-line a year ago, or the closest thing that we had to it, and we've lost him. Rob, you were going to say something there?
Yeah, I was just wondering if some of the questions that I had on that is, do you think that that's because of the fact that there's almost an entirely new offensive staff going on there, plus the new quarterback who's supposed to be the vocal leader, which obviously he is. So maybe we're seeing that evolution right now, but then all the running backs, right? The running back room is still kind of up in the air. So is the wide receiver room up in the air. The offensive line is up in the air. You were talking about the tight ends coach, and it's funny because I talked to Chancellor Brewington a couple months ago, and he loved the coach, and he just liked the relationship that they had, and absolutely just, I mean, adore might be a bad word to use, but
no,
he felt like he had really good, almost like a father-like relationship with him in the conversation that I had. So I wasn't too worried about that position, and maybe he's not too worried about his position group either on that side. But do you get the feeling who, if you had to pick somebody, who would you think might be that person?
Well, we now know that Travis Vokalek, and we did watch him a little bit, I should say, at the beginning of practice, when they do the kind of team grouping, they come together, they clap, they do the perfect jumping jack, that whole drill. Every year that kind of evolves who is the person. And I was actually really surprised because where I've seen it in the past, it's Garrett Nelson. And I looked over and it was Travis Vokalek today. So that was really interesting to me that Travis was the one leading that. I'm guessing they probably switch around, or they're trying to, especially as they're establishing these, what I'm assuming will end up being captains. I wouldn't be surprised if Garrett, I'm pretty positive Garrett Nelson is a captain this year. Wouldn't be shocked if Travis Vokalek is a captain as well. But here's the thing, and I'm going to go back to last season, and I said this a lot about Adrian Martinez, and I have the utmost amount of respect for Adrian. But the one thing I always said about him is that that like fire you needed came out in moments. It wasn't something that like he switched on and that's who he was from the get-go. Like there are certain moments where you saw, for instance, when he ran that one touchdown in against Colorado, and you saw him just like you saw him like that moment, and it was like, oh, you probably imagine that's what an out-of-body experience probably felt like for Adrian, was like how amped up he got in that moment. That was not his like working state. Like he was very level, and so like to get to that point where he is so firing, he's yelling and he's fired up, like something had to happen to kind of get him into that place. And I think you're seeing that a little bit still with this offense as a whole. Is there players who kind of need something to happen to get them super like in that moment, that get them super amped up. And I think what you're hearing, Casey and then Travis, and I think he said it was Turner Corcoran. I'm looking at it was him, Travis, and Turner. What they're asking for is they need more of like the immediate switch with that, where I'm like, here's the thing about Casey Thompson that I've kind of gathered. So I had a chance to talk to him just one-on-one today for a moment. He is constantly in a zone. Like he is like, for better or worse, I just want to say, like, people, it's one of those things where people, if you're doing well, people are going to applaud you for it. If you're doing poorly, they're going to come after you for it. But you can tell his mind is like he's not really 100%. Like he's so focused on the football, and he's so focused on like what he needs to do to improve the team, that like small talk is like, his mind is like not there. Like he's just like, cool, I'm not really interested in the small talk. I really just want to be here to talk football, and then I'm gonna go watch some film. That's like
He'd hate me.
What?
He'd hate me.
Yeah. Oh,
well,
me?
a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm sitting here. I'm like, do you want to talk about Star Wars? And he's like, I want to get to the film room. But like, he's asking for more of that, and that is a like. The easiest way for me to say this is when like Scott Frost has said in the past that like he wishes he could have a team of Garrett Nelsons. I get it. If you had a team of guys who are just so like, they're just, well, there would be challenges with that as well. I want to just point that out. But there would be something about like, you'd feel like everyone is bought into a certain degree. Everyone is so fired up. You know, every single play, what you're going to get 110% of them. And I think that's what the offense is asking for, is like, we want that, and we want more of it. And I don't think Nebraska's offense has had a ton of those. Like you said, they've had the Cam Jurgens, but like name more of those players.
Yeah,
on last
especially
year's
on
team.
the O line. You're going back to Richie Incognito and guys like that. I mean, you're going back a long ways to really get some of those really fiery guys. I think what was interesting is that the names that are being brought up, whether it's on offense or defense, it's guys that are really secure in their position right now. Vokalek, he's the starter, right? Thompson, it's pretty clear he's the starter. Those defensive guys, and on offense, especially at those wide receiver and running back positions, where we're going to get to a depth chart here, and I hate the word "or," and I'm throwing "or" all over it because I'm like, so when you have such a battle going on, I wonder if that's one of the byproducts of it is you're not getting some of the vocal from guys. Those guys are concentrating. They're trying to get every rep right. They're just trying to win a position, but you need the vocalness too.
It's also a personality thing, because I'm just gonna say, like, Ramir Johnson is just not like that. He is just a more quiet individual, and there's nothing wrong with being quiet. But like, I think of like my experience with, I would say, out of like looking at the 4 running backs that we kind of have at the top of the depth chart right now, between Ramir, Anthony Grant, Yant, Gabe Ervin Jr., like Yant might be the one where like I feel like has the most fire. And like, to your point, at that same time, he's probably not yet in a position to be that person for that group yet, or at least doesn't feel he is. Now, somebody could argue, well, if he just acted that way, maybe it would move him up the depth chart, blah, 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 blah. And like, there's so many arguments that are fair to be made. But I'm just saying, like, I could also see him being like, I'm not at a place to be, that loud person. I just need to keep my head down and get to work and get better so that I can keep moving and climbing and getting time. But like, I could also be completely misreading that situation. But I'm just saying, out of those 4, for instance, of just who I said, when I think about the conversations that we've had with them, Yant is probably the most, I don't want to even say like, he's not even really like loud, but I'm just saying like the most like personality driven of that group, and that like more like willing to kind of show his personality is what I'm meaning by that. It's just like I'm looking at like the depth chart that you sent me that you're working off of, and I'm looking at the names on here. And I agree. The cat does have an opinion, by the way. I was hearing the cat. I just like, I'm kind of like trying to think like who on here has kind of that edge. And yeah, like obviously, like we said, we know Casey Thompson, Turner Corcoran, and Travis Vokalek are kind of like those 3 initially. I would say Trey Palmer has the potential to have that edge. But of the other like offensive linemen, I'm just like not completely sure.
Yeah.
Like
we talked with Rob talked with Keith Williams back in February, and he's one of those guys that at least from the toughness and the just the swagger and everything, he brings that. I don't know from a practice standpoint how vocal and loud he is with it, but he we just need more guys like that. It's one of the reasons I always want the fullback position brought back too. Those guys tended to be somebody that would fill one of those roles. But
here's maybe like, I'm going to bring volleyball into this really quick because I have a point, but it's the best way I can explain it. Like, I think of like someone like Lauren Stivrins. You stood in Lauren Stivrins' presence and you immediately were like, I would not want to be on the other side of the net from her. Like, standing on the other side of the net would end badly for me. And it wasn't even like, you didn't even have to see her play to know that. You just got that sense. You felt it when you were in her presence. Like, this person is really good. That is an attitude. And like, I think you're right. I think a lot of these players on this team have kind of that like, you see them and they're like, okay, they've got kind of that swagger to them, if you will, or that like kind of a little bit of an attitude. But like, how does that attitude translate to like when you're standing near them? Do you have that sense in that moment of like, this person is like, I would hate to be on the other side? I think that's maybe what we're looking for, is kind of that, like that it's, as I'm kind of talking this through, it's like almost a confidence, if you will. It's just being like, and so it probably goes back to what you're even saying of like, hey, the people who are being the loudest and are being the most vocal are the ones who feel very confident in where they're at. They're confident in their position. So they're confident in being that person. But like, I don't know, like that is honestly the hardest thing to coach, is attitude and confidence and belief that you should be there. And when we talk about the importance of knowing how to win, like there's legitimacy in that. Like there is legitimacy in like when teams have not won in a long time, it's really hard to teach that winning attitude because you kind of almost have to experience it. So then you're like, how do you get yourself into that?
Yeah, the chicken and the egg, what has to come
chicken
first?
And the egg, who comes first?
Somewhere it has to. Well, we're going to get to a scoring explosion and go through the offense. But before we do, last tweet I want to show is we saw option. There was some option out there, and this makes Honky very happy because that is something that I've kind of said all off season, and I'm not the only one saying it, but that I'm a big believer in that we have some really good offensive minds on the staff. I think Whipple is an absolute great offensive mind. I think we would lose something over the offseason if there wasn't trying to take some of the best of what Frost does, some of the best of what the different coaches, I mean, what Raiola brings from the blocking standpoint, and Applewhite's coming from TCU. There's a lot of unique backgrounds, and of course Mickey Joseph in there too. So, we saw some quarterback run on just some of the videos we saw. What did you see watching practice?
We did see option, and I kind of knew. I was like, oh, people are going to be very very excited about that, because like I'm just looking at our observations from practice, but Drake Keeler actually noted this, that we saw a variety of option plays that included the triple option early on in like the practice. They mixed in some sweep handoffs that were like to the wide receivers. Yeah, like I think it basically what we now know, and we kind of, Frost has said this, where he's like, it's Whipple's, it's his show to run. But like, obviously Whipple wasn't running the option at Pittsburgh. That just wasn't really like his style there. Like that, it wasn't like what he was trying to do. So then you're like, yes, it is Whipple's to run, but obviously Frost has influence, or through whatever these conversations that they're having with each other, that we know that they're sitting down and, chit-chatting. Obviously they've talked about the triple option, and they've talked about what the Huskers did last year and maybe where they were successful previously.
That's my theory the entire offseason, is that I expect Frost to be very involved with the offense throughout the entire offseason, creating the X's and O's, creating the playbook, getting the verbiage together. I expect Frost to be very involved with that. I expect Frost to be very involved from Sunday to Friday with game planning. That's part of his job. What he needs to be able to do, though, is on Saturday, that's where you've got to be able to let Whipple be Whipple. We can't, the second they line up in 4 defensive linemen like Illinois did last year, we can't just say, oh, take the the headset back from Lubick. You can't do that. You got to let the guy be the OC on Saturday. But I expect Frost to be very involved the rest of the time with all the other parts of the offense.
I do, but I do think also in like the preparation, where he also is probably needing and has probably seen his role, or what we assume to see his role, shift through this fall. I guess this is what we're asking, and kind of we'll see it, is yes, on Saturday, if things go sideways, is he able to step back and be in that CEO role and allow his coordinators to handle it? He obviously lets Shenander handle things when things are going all different directions and figure it out. So does he allow Whipple then to do that? The other piece, though, that will be really interesting for me is, can he, like, obviously, again, they're sitting down. We know this. They're having conversations. He's a part of the planning. He's a part of the, hey, I've got some ideas. Let me bounce this off of you. Like, there's nothing, I don't think, that was ever in question, that he shouldn't be allowed to do that, or that not be allowed. It's his team. He can do whatever the hell he wants. But my point is, like, let's say hypothetically, Casey Thompson has a terrible game and Frost is like, we should give Chubba Purdy a chance. And Whipple's like, no, Casey's the guy. Like, no, I don't want to mess. Like, does he say, okay, understood? Or does he say, it's my team, I want to see, like, that's the part too, where I think people are really interested to kind of see how he also reacts throughout the week of, like, does he then just say, you're right, this is your offense to run, this is my perspective, let me tell you why I think you should listen to what I'm saying, or let me give my my feedback on that. But if Whipple or any coach says, nope, like, I hear you, but this is not how I want to run it, this is what I'm going to do, does he go, understood, that's your decision to make? That's going to be the really interesting one. And he kind of alluded to that when he said, I probably needed to stay out of some of these decisions, and I need to kind of back off of some of these things. I think that was him saying, got it, like, I was probably too in the weeds on some of this stuff.
All right, that's a great point there. Rob, you got something?
Well, I'm also wondering too, I mean, you remember Big Ten Media Days, and Coach Fitz was like, yeah, send us all the videos, send everything. Right. Well,
I was like, let us in. Come on.
Well, okay. So how much of them showing the triple, like, they can cut that video however they want to cut it. And they were very, very big about, like, running like the option, and they ran the quarterback draw. And I mean, they showed all these plays that, like, we're used to seeing, right? Swing pass. So I'm wondering how much of that too is to maybe even just give Northwestern, because they're going to look at it, just see that, how much is that to get in their heads as well, because it's it's only 2 weeks away. 2 weeks, people, 2 weeks.
I know. Here's the thing, like, they're not going to make it easy on Northwestern. The reality is, if you are Pat Fitzgerald and you're Northwestern, what you are doing right now is you are studying Nebraska's 2021 film and you're studying Pitt's 2021 film. You are having to study 2 teams. Even if you're like, we're confident Nebraska might run the option against us, like, even then, you also don't know if Nebraska is going to show up and completely abandon the option and go for everything that,
you're going to make Honky cry.
But yeah, everybody who's like, here's the deal. I just need to point this out. I had this conversation this week because Nebraska football on September 3rd kicks off at 2:30. Volleyball plays at 7. And I was trying to decide how likely that game will be anything like if that game could possibly be less than 4 hours. And I was like, if you're a run the ball type of person, you're like, heck yeah, let's go, because that game, could run by pretty fast. My fear is run the ball guy and gal are going to see a lot of passes.
Well, let's make them.
We're all going to be at Memorial Stadium for 6 hours every Saturday.
Let's make them complete passes then that take the clock.
Exactly. As long as the passes are complete, we're fine.
We're fine.
We're fine.
Boomer, do we have? I've seen a bunch of comments coming in. I'm not reading them. So, do we have any good questions or comments before we get into the scoring explosion? And let's get through the position groups.
Yeah, there's lots of different questions here. Some of them are position related, so I'll kind of save those for when we get to those.
Okay.
Specific opinions. One from listener Abby Harris. Whose personality among the new coaches has been the most surprising?
Brian Applewhite. His for sure. I don't know why. I'm not saying seeing him. For me, seeing him in action today, his press conference demeanor is so different than his on-field demeanor. And I don't know what it was, but I'm standing there and I'm like, who is this guy? Who is this person that I'm watching? And it's
so explain that to the Redcasters. What is his personality like in the press conference versus what you saw?
Yeah, in press conferences, he's just super even keel. He's cracking jokes. He's just he's explaining, he's explaining things very level. And you kind of just are I would say there are certain people in press conference settings where they're almost okay, memorable people in press conference settings is a Mario Verduzco. Everyone knew when Mario was talking, but even Mickey Joseph, Mickey Joseph is the one where we post his videos on YouTube and people lose their minds because they're this guy's amazing. This was the first week where I saw some of that a little bit with Brian Applewhite too, where people really picked up on his videos and were really it was almost kind of a shift in some ways, which I found really interesting. But then seeing him in person, now I understand players who have, played for him, people who have worked with him before probably are going none of this is a surprise. But for somebody, we didn't get to watch any practice in the spring. Obviously, the spring game presents a very different observation point. Actually getting to stand 6 feet from him and watch him in action and watch how he worked. I'm this is when we talk about turning that that fiery personality on, this is a person who knows how to do that. So if that gives you any kind of maybe hope with the running backs and how they'll kind of evolve with somebody like that, he definitely knows when I'm at the podium and I'm talking, this is my vibe, this is how I'm approaching that. And the second that he's on that practice field, it is a light bulb. It's completely different. So it stood out to me.
Yeah, and it seems too when just from the video and watching the different videos and everything, it seems he definitely has a different. You're right about the personality wise, but you can tell. But his players love him, so there's obviously a reason why. He builds that trust to the point where it almost seems okay, that makes sense how he can get away with that on the field and not. And even today in the press conference seemed a little bit different. He was much shorter, and it almost was kind of the "don't talk to me, talk to somebody else about this" sort of.
Well,
attitude,
that was
right?
Mickey Joseph today, who was like that. Brian Applewhite.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, Mickey Joseph is also somebody where I would say Mickey Joseph's press conference personality matches his on the field personality. They make a lot of sense with one another because he my favorite thing that he did today, and I have to say I love discovering people's personalities when they have a dry humor or dry wit to them. And one of the very first questions Mickey Joseph got asked was about Trey Palmer. He wasn't out on the field. And so he was hey, where was Trey Palmer? He's he wasn't out there, or what? Where was he? I didn't even and he starts looking around. He's I didn't even realize he wasn't out there. Oh, no. He just wasn't feeling well this morning. And so it was just kind of funny how he played into it and was kind of making a joke of it, and I appreciate a good sarcastic wit, and so that was pretty pretty good. And like I said, that matches, in my opinion, what you see from him on the practice.
Twitter handled all that really well too. I mean, with that, because obviously he was 100% serious the entire time. You know,
well, Twitter's known for being able to parse sarcasm versus, you know,
well,
Yes.
and
realities,
you know,
you know.
and nobody ever overreacts on there too. So it's always a good way to get a read on what's reasonable.